Sometimes the greatest threat to your freedom is invisible. A whisper in conversation, a subtle twist of truth, an unspoken weight holding you down. What if the people closest to you are shaping your reality for their own gain, pulling invisible strings you barely sense? This book isn't just about setting clearer boundaries. It is a journey into the dark undercurrent of manipulation, where control hides in kindness and domination wears a familiar face. Prepare to uncover the tactics most never see and discover the strength to reclaim your power, one boundary at a time. No More Control: Setting Firm Boundaries with Manipulators, written and published by Stealth Psychology. Chapter 1. Spotting Subtle Manipulation. Imagine you're sitting across from a friend at a cafe. The conversation flows naturally until the subject shifts to something you know is uncomfortable for them. Their eyes narrow almost imperceptibly, and they gently redirect the focus. "Are you sure you didn't misunderstand?" they ask, their voice soothing, yet there is an unmistakable chill beneath the words. As the afternoon goes on, you find yourself less confident in your recollection of events, even feeling guilty for bringing it up. This is not an obvious power play or outright deception. It is a quiet bending of your perception, a subtle nudge that leaves you questioning reality. On your way home, doubts creep in about what really happened and why you feel so uneasy. Beneath the calm surface, something unspoken has shifted, the unsteady ground of psychological manipulation. The masterful manipulator rarely needs to shout or threaten. Instead, they operate through suggestion, implication, and delicate influence. Their true aim is often not immediately visible to the victim. It may be the slow erosion of your confidence, a gentle but insistent push to spend more money on them, steering you away from people they dislike, or coaxing you to go along with choices against your own better judgment. Sometimes these silent tactics are cast as concern or affection, cloaked in language that disarms, confuses, and keeps you off balance. Over time, this patient, relentless maneuvering becomes routine. The manipulator crafts an environment where your resistance feels like betrayal. Your doubts seem irrational, and your own voice falters in the shadow of theirs. What is so insidious about manipulation is that the signs are rarely presented as warnings. Instead, they arrive as plausible deniability, disguised in friendly debates, comforting assurances, or barely noticeable corrections. You notice sudden guilt when your plans contradict someone else's wishes. Perhaps you shrink a little at their jokes, which always seem to target your insecurities but are brushed off as harmless teasing. Maybe your opinions slowly begin to shift as theirs rise in importance, and you rarely realize the cost until your need for approval eclipses your own needs and desires. By the time warning bells ring, you are already caught. The world you live in, once familiar, tilts in their favor. Victims frequently miss the manipulation as it shapes itself around their vulnerabilities, striking at insecurities or past experiences. Whether the endgame is emotional dominance, gaining control over your actions, draining your resources, or turning you against allies, the manipulator's motives are rooted in their need to orchestrate outcomes that serve themselves. The strings are near invisible until the moment you notice you've been dancing to someone else's tune. Recognition comes slowly, often after months or years, with a creeping sense that something essential has been lost. Yet even then, self-blame can overwhelm, a false conclusion meticulously nurtured by the manipulator. Spotting subtle manipulation means acknowledging that what is unseen can be the sharpest blade. It demands a willingness to examine what lies beneath comfort and routine, to sense where natural rapport collapses into compliance. By shining light into these quiet shadows, you begin to understand how manipulation lives and how you have the power to expose it, dismantle its scripts, and defend your autonomy, moment by moment, decision by decision. The emotional toll of manipulation is profound, often underestimated until its cumulative weight becomes nearly unbearable. Victims internalize confusion, shame, or even helplessness following persistent exposure to manipulative tactics, rarely suspecting the true origin of their distress. When someone relentlessly undermines your intuition or reframes shared history to favor their perspective, a subtle but corrosive self-doubt takes root. The mind clings to inconsistencies, yet the heart aches for connection and validation. intensifying the wound as internal equilibrium is overwhelmed by uncertainty. When a friend, partner, or family member routinely upturns your feelings and responses, over time your emotional boundaries thin until even your most authentic feelings feel suspect. Just as Sylvia, a corporate professional, experienced, these distortions often go unnoticed in the rush of daily life. Her manager lauded her diligence publicly, while, in meetings behind closed doors, wielding concern and criticism in equal measure, and always couching directives as opportunities for improvement. Over time, Sylvia second-guessed even straightforward tasks. At home, this uncertainty snowballed into irritability and chronic anxiety, triggered not by workload, but by an ever-present dread of missteps. In her search for solid ground, Sylvia leaned harder into overperformance, desperate for approving words that never fully materialized. The manipulation, hidden behind compliments, slowly drained her confidence, leaving her emotionally spent and professionally isolated. The reason why such manipulation is devastating lies in its quiet penetration of core decision-making processes. When seated doubts and second-guessed opinions dominate your thinking, even the simplest choices become fraught. Instead of acting from a place of clarity or personal truth, you hesitate, ruminate, appeal for reassurance, often to the exact person engineering those doubts. This vicious cycle hollows out self-trust, replacing it with a dependency on the manipulator's perceived authority. Academic findings, such as those by Dr. George Simon in his psychological research, reaffirm how manipulators exploit their target's conscience and willingness to assume responsibility, twisting these virtues into levers for control. The individual suffering this treatment begins to lose perspective on what is rational or fair, as the manipulator subtly edits reality. Interpersonally, the impact multiplies. With self-esteem under constant attack, relationships that once offered comfort or joy become minefields of doubt. Family gatherings, social outings, or even text conversations may trigger anxiety, as past manipulation imprints suspicion on the smallest gesture or phrase. Often, other loved ones struggle to understand the shift, sometimes blaming the victim for hypersensitivity or withdrawal. Over time, the fabric of one's support system frays, replaced by mistrust or a guardedness that impedes emotional intimacy. A revealing study conducted at the University of California, Berkeley, highlighted the spillover effect of such manipulation. Those exposed to subtle forms of emotional control were more likely to experience chronic loneliness, a loss of social ties, and delayed recovery from trauma. The pressing question remains: why do people fall so repeatedly for these hidden tactics? A fundamental answer lies in human nature. People crave connection, safety, and approval. Manipulators skillfully disguise control as care, exploiting natural vulnerabilities with the practiced ease of one who has rehearsed every move. Victims are drawn again and again to familiar scripts where affection, dependency, and self-doubt entwine, keeping them anchored just out of sight of true liberation. This subtle, dangerous dance can ensnare even the most self-aware individuals, which is why recognizing manipulation before it takes root is vital. As we move forward, the next part will reveal the hidden warning signs most people overlook, arming you with the knowledge to expose even the finest thread of manipulation woven into your daily life. Manipulators are rarely random in their selection of targets. Instead, they are acutely attuned to perceived vulnerabilities, scanning their environments keenly for individuals who seem especially eager to please, uncertain of themselves, or hungry for approval. They instinctively recognize social cues: the person who always caves in during group decision-making, the colleague who avoids confrontation, the partner who minimizes their own needs to keep peace. These traits attract the manipulator like a beacon, providing fertile ground for influence to take hold. Unlike overt aggression, manipulation begins with affirmation and subtle tailoring of interactions. But always the intent is to find a chink in the armor, a point through which influence can seep and deepen over time. Consider the case of Daniel, who moved to a new city and, battling loneliness, quickly befriended a seemingly charming neighbor, Liam. Liam's interest was flattering. He listened intently, remembered the smallest details, and always seemed supportive. Over several months, Daniel realized that his life had quietly reoriented around Liam's preferences. He'd stopped connecting with other neighbors who Liam criticized, changed his daily routine to fit mutual plans, and even felt it necessary to consult Liam on every major decision, whether buying furniture or seeking new friends. Any gentle attempts to assert his own wishes were met with disappointment or mild guilt from Liam, who never raised his voice, but somehow left Daniel feeling selfish each time independence surfaced. This gradual reshaping of Daniel's world was almost imperceptible, a psychological shift occurring so incrementally that by the time he noticed, disentangling himself seemed daunting. Researchers note that manipulators often employ techniques known as testing boundaries, using slight provocations to gauge how their target reacts under pressure. Does the person object when plans are canceled at the last minute? Do they apologize even when they're not at fault? Once compliance is observed, pressure increases, sometimes as subtle as a worried look when the target references an outside friend, or as overt as pulling away emotionally when boundaries are asserted. In one study published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, experts observed these early microaggressions, often dismissed by the target as misunderstandings, eventually coalesce into a paradigm where the manipulator is central and the victim's world has contracted around the manipulator's desires and worldview. What unfolds psychologically during this process is as significant as the behavioral shifts themselves. The victim's baseline confidence begins to erode. Decisions once made effortlessly are now fraught with worry over someone else's approval. Emotional energy is silently siphoned into anticipating the manipulator's feelings, abandoning one's own. Over time, identity becomes blurred, not just because the manipulator's tactics have demanded conformity, but because the continuous yielding becomes a new way of being, a self shaped by someone else's needs. The victim finds themselves second-guessing ambitions, curbing enthusiasm, and defining self-worth only in terms of the manipulator's reinforcement or criticism. Enduring this psychological transformation can be alarming, as the loss of autonomy and self-regard is often hidden beneath a surface of harmony and concern. However, understanding these tactics in action is the crucial first step toward fortifying boundaries and reclaiming control. This self-awareness not only inoculates against future manipulations, but also creates a foundation for mounting an effective defense. In the next part, the escalation of control will be examined, revealing how seemingly gentle influence tightens into inescapable cycles, and how these traps close around even the most unsuspecting targets. Chapter 2. Breaking the Control Cycle. Picture a couple sitting at the dinner table, the conversation winding through the rituals of daily life. The tone is light at first, focused on work and plans for the weekend, but halfway through the meal, the atmosphere subtly changes. One partner, Julia, hesitates before mentioning she'd like to spend Saturday with a friend she hasn't seen in months. Across the table, her husband Mark's smile falters. He doesn't protest openly, nor does he demand she stay. Instead, he leans back, sighs, and says, "Of course you should go." His words are permissive, but his silence lingers. Small reminders slip into the conversation. "I had a difficult week. I was hoping we could relax together." Or, "But I guess I'll be fine on my own." The message is never direct, but the result is clear. Julia feels selfish, torn, and an unspoken pressure to choose him over her long-standing friendship. The night ends with her quietly canceling her plans, Mark offering a warm embrace that masks the subtle power he just exercised. The cycle remains intact. What Julia experiences is not just ordinary persuasion or a benign request for company. It is a patterned, calculated maneuver aimed at achieving compliance and emotional control. Here, the manipulator's goal is to erode her independence without appearing overtly controlling. By speaking in veiled disappointment and gently leveraging her empathy, Mark ensures that his desires consistently win out, even as he manages to appear supportive. At the core of this method is the collection of little wins, small sacrifices made day after day that over time amount to a profound loss of autonomy. For many, these scenarios do not register as red flags. Instead, they are written off as relationship compromises, just being sensitive, or reading too much into things. The manipulator counts on this rationalizing. Their success thrives on ambiguity, as every subtle nudge is easily dismissed as accidental or trivial when scrutinized in isolation. Only when viewed collectively does the quiet erosion become visible, like a coastline worn smooth by persistent, gentle waves. The manipulator rarely has just one aim. Sometimes it is emotional dominance, other times it's social isolation or even financial extraction. Each subtle bending of the victim's will feeds into a broader strategy that deepens dependence and weakens resistance. By sowing doubts about outside relationships, by subtly deriding personal decisions, and by rewarding obedience with conditional affection, manipulators build invisible cages that only become apparent once the door has quietly closed. Victims remain entangled because the dynamics are not built on single acts of aggression, but through a rhythm of daily surrender. It is difficult to pinpoint the moment autonomy slipped away because every concession is made to keep peace or avoid discomfort. The cumulative weight of compliance is heavy, but distributed across so many episodes and justifications that the truth of captivity remains out of view until the control is absolute. Breaking the control cycle requires a clarity that few possess while in the midst of manipulation. It demands honest confrontation with reality, a realization that loyalty and empathy have been turned against the victim, and that continued participation only deepens the entanglement. Uncovering this hidden truth is both jarring and liberating, illuminating the true cost of ongoing compliance and offering the first hope that the cycle can be broken if one dares to see it. Once the cycle of control is underway, its distortions split quietly through every layer of survival, shifting the victim's inner framework more than they could ever anticipate. Emotions turn turbulent and confusing. There's a lingering sense of guilt or obligation so persistent that it seeps into even the most private thoughts. The uncertainty fostered by subtle manipulation seeps into the bloodstream of daily life, growing into a chronic anxiety in situations that once sparked joy or anticipation. Everyday choices, what to say, whom to meet, where to go, become trials rather than expressions of self. The repeated deferring of one's wishes constricts those boundaries that uphold individuality, until the very idea of making independent decisions is laced with hesitation or dread. Internal landscapes, once vivid and certain, are replaced by second guesses and unrelenting self-interrogation. The impact ripples outward, fracturing relationships and rewriting the rules of intimacy. One compelling example is Elisa, a once outgoing college student whose boyfriend, over months together, quietly peeled away her social supports. At first it seemed natural. He'd prefer to have her close on weekends, cautioning subtly that some of her friends weren't good influences or really understood her. Whenever Elisa entertained meeting them, he withdrew emotionally, planting just enough doubt to shift her choices. Gradually shaped by his preferences, Elisa found herself perpetually apologizing for considering her own needs. As her world grew smaller, even interacting with family provoked guilt, while his conditional affection left her believing her value depended entirely on his satisfaction. Research corroborates how insidiously emotional control gnaws away at self-regard. A study by psychologists Jerry Berger and Julie Cooper demonstrated that repeated compliance in manipulated relationships leads participants to view themselves as less competent and more dependent than those in balanced partnerships. The manipulator, through subtle strategies of reward and withdrawal, creates an emotional ecosystem where distress is relieved only through the approval of the controller. Victims learn, almost imperceptibly, that safety, affirmation, and a sense of belonging are only possible if they comply. When disappointment or disapproval does surface, it lands with exaggerated weight, prompting frantic efforts to restore harmony. In this perpetual chase, individuality, self-confidence, and even authentic joy are lost, displaced by a growing compulsion to please. Yet, paradoxically, the targets of such manipulation frequently find themselves defending their controller or rationalizing their situation. The strength of attachment, the fear of conflict, and the desperate hope that affection will resume all overshadow logic and weave further entanglement. Empathy is weaponized, turned inward, making the victim believe that their concerns are exaggerations or that sacrifice is simply part of deep connection. Because victims often pride themselves on loyalty and adaptability, they blame themselves for problems that are systematically planted and watered by the manipulator. The danger is not just in the day-to-day concessions, but in the slow destruction of autonomy, spirit, and clarity. People who fall into these control cycles often face an uphill battle in re-establishing a sense of self, a challenge magnified by the invisible nature of the wounds inflicted. This is why learning to spot these cycles is crucial, not only to break free, but to protect the core elements of one's identity in all future relationships. As we move forward, be ready to discover the hidden warning signs, those subtle signals of entrapment that almost everyone overlooks until it's almost too late. Manipulators rarely leave their choice of targets to chance. Instead, they observe sharply, searching for silent tells that reflect vulnerability, unmet emotional needs, or a strong desire to please. A subtle lack of assertiveness, frequent apologies, or visible discomfort in interpersonal tension speaks volumes to those who would exploit. The manipulator positions themselves as understanding, generous, or uniquely attuned to the target, silently drawing on foundational psychology. People want to feel seen and valued, especially when life or relationships have recently shaken their confidence. These predators thread themselves into those gently exposed wounds, offering precisely what is missing in return for initial small concessions. In truth, these small surrenders are stepping stones to much larger ones that accumulate with astonishing speed. Consider the case of Marcus, a dedicated nonprofit professional eager to make a lasting difference. Eager to prove himself at a new job, he worked tirelessly for a manager who seemed charismatic but threw subtle jabs during meetings. At first, it played out as playful teasing when Marcus questioned a process, but the jokes quickly ramped up in frequency when others joined in. Gradually, his questions faded, replaced with a quiet acquiescence that he hardly noticed developing. When voluntary projects arose, the manager dropped hints about company loyalty and the team family, nudging Marcus to take on unpaid responsibilities, while others remained silent. When Marcus contemplated pushing back, he felt shame for even considering confrontation, a classic sign of creeping manipulation. By blending praise with situational guilt and stirring Marcus's longing to contribute, the manipulator quietly entrapped him, transmuting his value system into a lever for exploitation. Complex psychological shifts power this cycle. Early on, being valued or chosen by the manipulator provides a rush of validation, confirmation that one's time, talent, or care is finally appreciated. The target feels lucky, even special, unaware of the calculated grooming at play. But as the cycle continues, the manipulator subtly lowers boundaries and heightens dependency, requiring more and more sacrifice under the guise of team unity, love, or friendship. This blend of subtle reward and implied threat reshapes choices and dulls intuition. Over time, the manipulated person stops evaluating whether requests are fair, healthy, or in their best interest, focusing instead on avoiding the sudden chill, withdrawal, or disappointment that signals their benefactor's displeasure. Psychological research backs this pattern of shifting from initial gratitude to a sense of inescapable obligation. In a landmark study, social psychologist Dr. Robert Cialdini observed that individuals placed under social obligation quickly magnified their efforts to please, even when requests became increasingly unreasonable. It is this interplay between validation and mild punishment that wears down defenses and molds compliance. Once recognized red flags become blurred against a backdrop of rationalized compromise. The victim may even guard the manipulator's reputation out of a twisted loyalty or embarrassment. Understanding these patterns, how manipulators choose targets, gradually escalate their influence, and orchestrate a blend of validation with subtle disapproval, forms the foundation for resistance. Recognizing the stages is the first move out of the shadows and back toward autonomy, self-assertion, and true choice. In the next part, prepare to examine how control not only continues but intensifies, locking the victim inside wider and tighter cycles from which escape can seem nearly impossible. Chapter 3. Building Boundary Awareness. On a late Sunday evening, Sarah sat on her living room couch, phone pressed reluctantly to her ear, shoulders tense as her cousin Rebecca launched into another barrage of complaints and requests. At first, Sarah had felt sympathy and even a sense of duty. Rebecca was struggling, after all, and family should help when able. But as weeks drifted into months, these conversations came to dominate every weekend. If Sarah hesitated to answer or tried to reclaim her time, Rebecca pivoted swiftly, describing vague crises, dropping hints that made Sarah feel selfish for needing rest, and escalating the emotional debt with each conversation. Initially, it all felt manageable, small sacrifices spread across ordinary days. But, without realizing, Sarah had come to dread her phone's ring. Simple pleasures or plans with friends now prompted guilt. The familial bond once so warm had curled into something laced with obligation and a persistent undercurrent of exhaustion. When an acquaintance asked how she was doing, the numbness of her reply surprised them both. The manipulator's quiet aim is nearly always the same: to extend their reach into another's sense of self, draining energy, distorting loyalties, or quietly commandeering resources under the guise of genuine need. Rebecca never shouted or demanded. Instead, she encroached with a narrative of dependence and emotional necessity. Underlying her persistence was a long-term design, the kind that replaces tough love with the relentless art of making boundaries feel like betrayals. What played out with Rebecca and Sarah was not simply uneven support, but an erosion of Sarah's natural instincts for self-preservation. In these dynamics, the early stages of manipulation slip in unannounced. Most victims fail to see the full extent of the trap for one reason: boundary erosion is nearly invisible at first. What begins as empathy, favor trading, or compromise morphs into a chronic inability to assert one's own priorities. Manipulators count on this slow fade. Each concession is rational, each favor justifiable in isolation. The full shape of the loss only becomes apparent when energy wanes and former joys feel burdened or forbidden. Even then, self-reproach tends to outweigh suspicion. Why am I so drained? Am I not compassionate enough? Instead of identifying external encroachment, the victim turns accusation inward, reinforcing the cycle. What remains hidden to most is that the slow, circling drain on the individual's sense of autonomy is deliberate and systematic. Sarah, like so many others, began to shift her own schedule reflexively to Rebecca's needs. Her hobbies, social outings, and moments of solitude were traded one at a time for the role of perpetual responder. The conditioning was gentle yet persistent. Through gratefulness and coded accusations of abandonment, Rebecca deepened the sense of duty, blurring any memory of what boundaries felt like. This progressive weakening, so ordinary on the surface, is the manipulator's primary tool, transforming the reasonable impulse to help into a prison of guilt and fatigue. The first step toward escape, though daunting, is awareness, recognizing when care and compromise have silently crossed into the realm of self-neglect. These early warning signs hold enormous power, and understanding their influence can mean the difference between quietly losing oneself and reclaiming the strength to draw a line. When boundary erosion is gradual, the emotional toll is as subtle as it is devastating. With each encroachment, victims like Sarah experience a swelling undercurrent of anxiety, one that frequently goes unlabeled. The desire to maintain harmony, uphold self-image as kind or dependable, and avoid disappointment in others converts festering discomfort into an accepted norm. Genuine feelings of frustration or resentment are swiftly repressed, replaced by growing guilt or self-justification whenever the thought of resisting even briefly crosses the mind. In time, this internal pressure mutates into emotional numbness and persistent fatigue, warning signs mistaken for simple busyness or the burdens of adult life, while in truth signaling the decay of self-protective instincts. Decision-making becomes fraught, a battleground of loyalties endlessly split between personal needs and manipulated expectation. Studies such as those conducted by Dr. Terry Apter at Cambridge University reveal that individuals conditioned to minimize their own needs struggle not only with daily choices but with envisioning a future unshaped by another's demands. Basic questions: should I rest or answer the phone? Am I allowed to prioritize my plans? No longer have simple answers. The invisible rules of the manipulator now govern the landscape. A single act of asserting one's needs triggers intrusive rumination and a disproportionate fear of repercussions. Even in routine exchanges, the victim's voice shrinks, diluted by a reflexive urge to accommodate, apologize, or downplay personal boundaries. The sustained impact on relationships, too, is lasting and severe. The manipulated party becomes ever more isolated. Friends comment on their absence or sense a withdrawal, but rarely understand the origin. Attempts to reach out may be met with defensiveness or preemptive justifications that echo the manipulator's logic. Familial bonds, social networks, and intimate partnerships are suppressed or abandoned to avoid conflict with the agent of boundary violation. Meanwhile, the manipulator consolidates influence, binding the victim closer with reminders of loyalty, shared hardship, or exclusivity. Over time, the willingness or even ability to seek support from other sources withers, leaving dependency nearly absolute. Underpinning every layer of this concealment is a haunting wound to self-esteem. Real-life accounts, like that of Michael, a young musician whose mentor regularly reframed late-night calls for him to cancel performances or gigs, show how easily authority or expectation morphs into psychological compliance. Michael, praised for flexibility, but met with subtle shame when resisting, began to internalize not only the belief that his time or goals mattered less, but also that he was selfish for wanting space. When he finally paused to assess why music brought less joy, he discovered that his own boundaries, once clear and motivating, had been methodically undermined. Why people fall for such persistent breaches is intertwined with human instincts to empathize, cooperate, and avoid confrontation. Manipulators, knowingly or unconsciously, press those internal levers, rewarding acquiescence and punishing assertion, until help and sacrifice feel required and justified. The boundary between empathy and self-sacrifice blurs until only exhaustion and disorientation remain. Recognizing these destructive cycles is not merely a matter of emotional survival, but of reclaiming control and dignity. As the next part unfolds, you will uncover the most overlooked warning signs, signposts that mark the descent from kindness into harm, granting you the clarity necessary to reawaken and defend your personal boundaries before any greater damage is done. Manipulators are adept at selecting targets whose boundaries are already compromised by past disappointment, need for connection, or a natural tendency to accommodate others. These individuals are often identified through simple social cues. They are the first to take on unwanted tasks at work, the friend who never says no, or the partner whose personal priorities are always secondary to the needs of others. In their quest for recipients of influence, manipulators frequently gravitate toward those in states of transition or insecurity, such as new employees eager to prove their worth, individuals recently out of long-term relationships, or caregivers stretched thin by obligation. These circumstances leave subtle signs, apologetic gestures, nervous laughter, over-eagerness to help, that invite boundary testing by those seeking advantage. A real-world scenario can clarify this process. In a community volunteer group, Allison, fresh out of college and new in the city, threw herself into every project, always eager to be noticed and to make friends. Marjorie, the group's unofficial leader, quickly picked up on Allison's self-deprecating humor and willingness to accept last-minute requests. Gradually, Marjorie began assigning Allison the most time-consuming and least rewarding jobs, justifying them with casual praise about Allison's dependability. When Allison finally expressed mild frustration, Marjorie gently suggested that her work ethic was inspiring and no one else could do it as well, turning criticism into a sly form of flattery that further enticed compliance. With each encroachment, Allison's exhaustion grew, but the guilt at the prospect of letting anyone down was stronger still. What appeared on the surface as respect-worthy volunteering was, beneath, a carefully orchestrated manipulation of Allison's desire for acceptance and fear of disapproval. Psychological shifts for the manipulated emerge quietly. Initially, being singled out for tasks or concern brings a sense of validation as one's help is repeatedly acknowledged. Gradually, the balance tips, external affirmation is no longer uplifting, but expected, and even subtle changes in the manipulator's demeanor inspire anxiety. Routine requests morph into tests of allegiance, and hesitation is met with implicit threats, loss of affection, withdrawal of praise, social coldness, or Boolean reminders of past help. Over time, the manipulated person learns to anticipate needs before they are voiced, sacrificing rest, pleasure, and self-respect to avoid the emotional backlash that follows when boundaries are asserted. Research by clinical psychologist Dr. Nina Brown illuminates how individuals with boundary ambiguity are at increased risk. These targets, having internalized the notion that denying requests is unkind, are more likely to overlook their own needs, further inviting encroachment. What begins as reciprocation soon blurs into repeated sacrifice for another's convenience. The psychological toll is rarely sudden. Instead, self-worth is slowly mortgaged for short-term approval, while underlying fatigue and resentment simmer beneath a polished veneer of helpfulness. Understanding these tactics, how targets are chosen, the timing and methods of subtle boundary crossing, and the psychological changes that enable ongoing manipulation is not only essential but foundational for reclaiming autonomy. Recognizing the pattern creates the space necessary to question, to pause, and to ultimately recover one's voice. This growing self-awareness serves as both sword and shield, laying the groundwork for resistance. As we progress to the next chapter, prepare to see how boundary violations intensify, solidifying cycles that demand conscious and determined intervention to escape. Chapter 4: Communicating Limits with Power. It's Monday morning at the office, and David is at his desk, already wading through a backlog of emails when his manager Carla stops by. She flashes a quick smile before dropping yet another urgent task into his lap, one that clearly falls outside his original job description. "You're really the only one I trust to handle this," she says. Before David can utter a word, Carla adds that the deadline can't be missed and that the team is counting on his usual dedication. This isn't the first time Carla has displaced responsibilities onto David. She goes out of her way to frame her requests as compliments or dodges any direct discussion whenever he hints at being overworked. At team meetings, Carla publicly thanks David for his tireless support, fueling a narrative that keeps him silent and complicit. Listening to his coworkers join in the applause, David swallows his discomfort for fear of seeming uncooperative. Weeks pass, and each instance feels trivial in isolation, yet the weight grows, his boundaries shrinking with every unspoken protest. What David does not realize is that this scenario isn't about teamwork or fair delegation. Carla's ultimate goal is simple. She has learned how to engineer his compliance through a calculated mixture of praise, implied expectations, and social proof. The emotional burden increases not because the work is impossibly hard, but because David's quiet acquiescence has replaced direct communication with resentment dressed as obligation. The truth is stark. Beneath every gesture of trust and statement of faith in his capabilities, there lies a tacit assertion of power. Carla's pattern of inconsistent feedback and selective gratitude keeps David entangled in a cycle where compliance is prized, while the boundaries he once enforced fade to the periphery. This cycle is particularly sinister because it initially masquerades as normal workplace dynamics, even positive affirmation. The manipulator counts on their target's willingness to maintain harmony and protect their reputation, spinning recognition into currency for extracting even more. Subtle but unyielding, this type of communication is engineered to avoid any overt confrontation, which would trigger resistance or external scrutiny. Instead, it exploits psychological pressure points: fear of disapproval, craving for acceptance, and dread of social isolation. By staging her requests as celebrations of David's talent, Carla compels him to abandon self-protection out of loyalty and a subconscious need to belong. Victims like David typically fail to recognize the full extent of their entrapment until the cost becomes undeniable. Long before burnout or resentment sets in, the habit of granting silent consent takes root, crowding out agency and distorting perspective. Without realizing it, David's voice has been trained into silence, and what began as cooperation has slipped into servitude. The manipulator's methods have carved out a corner of his identity, convincing him that his worth is measured not by boundaries, but by how little he resists. Uncovering this dynamic, in which ordinary interactions become quiet collisions of intention, is the first key to breaking free. Once you see that every loaded compliment and exploitative honor is a tactic, not an accident, you can begin to summon the power to reclaim your voice. Even when words are weapons wielded subtly, recognizing the mechanics behind them is the start of true, effective resistance. The cumulative emotional strain of communication that blurs praise with pressure is deep and destabilizing, often leaving victims like David conflicted, not only about their work, but about their own instincts. On the surface, the affirmation feels good. Being singled out as reliable or exceptional seems like a mark of value. Yet beneath each compliment lies the growing unease of unspoken demands. Soon, genuine pride in achievement gives way to quiet dread at every new assignment, and satisfaction withers under the expectation of tireless compliance. This arena of psychological warfare obscures where approval ends and guilt begins, and over time, the boundary between voluntary action and forced submission all but disappears. Anxiety subtly invades everyday interactions, causing victims to second-guess not only their abilities, but their judgments about the people around them. Decision-making becomes clouded under the weight of these distorted communications. The internal narrative shifts as exhaustion grows. If I say no, will they stop trusting me? If I set a limit, will I lose respect or opportunity? With each cycle, self-doubt grows. This relentless questioning supplies the manipulator with a steady current of compliance as the victim becomes less able or willing to distinguish healthy cooperation from unhealthy obligation. A revealing longitudinal case study from the American Psychological Association tracked nurse managers in hospital settings, finding that those subjected to persistent, expectation-laden praise were far more susceptible to compassion fatigue, self-blame, and career dissatisfaction. The study showed how, when persistent affirmation overrides clear boundaries, caregivers struggle to assert proportional limits, often rationalizing overwork as ethical duty until unraveling emotionally becomes inevitable. The effects spill across relationships, infecting how the victim relates to others as well as themselves. Consider the real-world workplace of Melissa, an administrative assistant who, over several years, became her office's unofficial problem solver. Her boss, always gracious with words of public appreciation, rarely shouldered responsibility himself. The situation quietly isolated Melissa from her peers, who began to resent her for making them look bad by constantly taking on extra work. Rather than recognizing manipulation, Melissa doubted her own feelings of being used, avoiding conversations about boundaries out of fear she would seem ungrateful or difficult. Over time, her sense of identity blended with her role as a fixer, disconnecting her from the social and emotional support she most needed. Psychological research emphasizes that this is no accident. Studies from social influence theorists note how manipulators anchor their version of reality through selective compliments and the framing of routine favors as extraordinary. This support as control tactic discourages resistance by embedding requests in a context of positive reinforcement and shared purpose. Those targeted tend to be exceptionally empathetic, cooperative, or eager to preserve group cohesion, traits that, ironically, are inverted into points of access for control. People fall for these tactics precisely because the manipulation masquerades as care and because withdrawal of approval feels like a profound loss. Loyalty, the desire to prove oneself, and fear of rejection are manipulated until the habit of silence and compliance replaces honest communication. It is a vulnerability rooted not in weakness, but in the very virtues that usually foster trust and teamwork. To truly reclaim one's agency, it's vital to recognize the quiet devastation these dynamics create. As the next section unfolds, you will learn to recognize the subtle cracks in communication, the nuanced cues and unspoken expectations that almost everyone overlooks, yet serve as critical early warnings that your limits are under threat. Manipulators do not act at random, but instead sharpen their focus on those most likely to bend, intentionally seeking out individuals whose boundaries can be shaped to meet their own ends. Frequently, their targets are highly conscientious, naturally eager to please, or in circumstances where proving worth feels vital. Manipulators observe how people respond to small initial requests, subtle emotional cues, or moments requiring cooperation, quietly probing until a pattern of compliance emerges. Their early moves are rarely direct. They could begin with a harmless ask or a situation framed as urgent yet flattering to the targeted individual's skill. What they look for and swiftly find are those who hesitate to say no, those who put others' comfort above their own needs, and those quietly uncomfortable with confrontation. A scenario that illustrates this well-involved Priya, a junior project manager new to her company and keen to establish a positive reputation. Her supervisor, Nora, quickly noticed that Priya rarely objected during meetings, even when tasks migrated to her plate without her explicit agreement. At first, Nora complimented Priya's organization and reliability, then began publicly doling out more responsibilities under the guise of these strengths. As deadlines loomed, Nora would call late in the evening, open with apologies, then say, "You're always so proactive, I know I can count on you," making it seem Priya was being given an honor rather than a burden. Each request carried an unspoken pressure. Being singled out was both a reward and an implicit expectation not to break rank. Priya soon realized that questioning an assignment made Nora distant, even cold. Afterward, the office atmosphere tightened, isolating Priya and escalating her anxiety about her standing in the group. Little by little, Priya's willingness to question, decline, or even clarify became stifled. Her internal monologue gradually shifted from one of measured optimism to a desperate need not to disappoint. The psychological journey for targets like Priya is deceptively slow. Initial episodes of recognition make the individual feel valued. Their opinion matters. Their reputation is directly tied to their contributions. With time, however, this sense of self-worth fuses with the anticipation of the manipulator's needs. They rethink interactions, stifle instincts to protest, and weigh all decisions through the filter of another's approval. This internal redirection, where one's emotional compass seeks validation only through compliance, leaves a lasting impression and dulls the capacity to self-advocate. The manipulator's strategy capitalizes on the victim's disconnect from their deeper values or priorities, introducing a rift that widens every time resistance falters and is met not with understanding, but with chilly disapproval or subtle rebuke. Academic research confirms these patterns. In controlled studies on group dynamics, individuals who demonstrated high levels of empathy and need for positive reinforcement quickly became the default contributors in collaborative environments, regardless of their formal role. Manipulators exploited these patterns, always escalating requests, coaching targets into silence, and then leveraging that silence into routine advantage. Such schemes bypass conscious recognition, camouflaged as trust or merit, but ultimately degrade both performance and morale. Understanding these tactics is a vital measure of defense. To resist, one must decode how silently the terrain shifts from healthy collaboration to covert domination. Awareness without self-reproach becomes the first tool, allowing targets to pause, reassess, and reclaim their voice. In our next section, we will dissect how these situations escalate, trapping the unsuspecting in even tighter cycles of compliance and loss. This knowledge arms you for the journey from compelled silence to empowered, principled communication. Chapter 5. Standing Strong Under Pressure. The clink of cutlery echoes across the dining table as Maria listens to her longtime friend, Thomas, recount another list of emergencies. Thomas's pleas always fall somewhere between desperation and affection. He calls in small favors, help with groceries, rides after late-night parties, support when an unexpected bill threatens his comfort. Maria, deeply loyal, always finds a way to say yes. Wanting to be the reliable friend Thomas claims nobody else is. But over the years, these requests have multiplied, and so have the guilt-laden stories that arrive with every new demand. When Maria dares voice exhaustion, Thomas becomes sullen, drops hints about her abandonment, or brings up every past kindness as moral evidence that her loyalty is on the line. Unpacking it logically only leaves Maria more confused. Her friend never shouts or makes threats, yet a manufactured crisis always pulls her back into helping. What she cannot see clearly is how these emotional storms have gradually hemmed her into a role scripted by unrelenting obligation, where her needs matter only if they serve to rescue someone else. The ultimate goal in these interactions is often invisible at first. For Thomas, it has little to do with food or rides. What he seeks is reliable emotional authority. He positions himself as helpless in the face of life, placing Maria in perpetual rescue mode and refusing to acknowledge her fatigue without redirecting the focus to himself. By establishing his dilemma as central and her help as proof of love, he creates a logic in which withdrawal becomes morally unacceptable. Maria, sensing she cannot truly solve his recurring chaos, feels herself slipping into a cycle of lived fatigue. Time blurs, her moments of rest evaporate, and she quietly pushes away relationships that spot the manipulation for what it is. No one event in itself appears sinister, and that slight plausibility ensures the trap is rarely noticed, until a breaking point sneaks up and shatters the illusion. Under these conditions, even the most capable and self-sufficient people struggle to identify the line between genuine care and coerced sacrifice. Years pass, and their own boundaries shrink bit by bit until questioning this dynamic provokes acute anxiety, guilt, or even shame. The manipulator's demands, laced with emotional storytelling and appeals to history, are never truly about the short-term problem. They're about establishing dominance, engineering dependence, and ensuring constant access to the victim's energy or resources. Subtle social isolation is introduced when outsiders challenge the pattern, making the victim feel that only the manipulator truly understands or values their efforts. At its core, this strategy replaces reciprocity with dependence, a shift almost invisible in the midst of everyday life, yet devastating in hindsight. It's this dangerous gradualism that ensures so many blindsides. Victims convince themselves that every friendship takes work, or that every family member gets tired sometimes, rationalizing the growing imbalance because each individual demand seems minor compared to the relationship's emotional weight. Only when their own needs evaporate and clarity is dulled by years of learned helplessness do they sense that standing strong might require far more than polite refusals or temporary withdrawal. Instead, it demands profound self-assertion in the face of continuous pressure, recognizing that ongoing sacrifice is not friendship, but a silent contract of servitude. This is the underlying truth so often obscured as people quietly lose themselves under the steady, relentless push of someone else's needs. When subjected to prolonged emotional pressure, victims experience the slow corrosion of their internal resources. Resilience fades, clarity wanes, and emotional equilibrium is replaced by a chronic undercurrent of anxiety. The constant need to anticipate a manipulator's next crisis trains the brain into hypervigilance. Instead of finding satisfaction in acts of kindness, the victim becomes tethered to the manipulator's moods and spiraling urgency. Over time, emotional exhaustion transforms ordinary days into ordeals, strained by dread and self-doubt. The simple joys that once brought spark and color to life can seem tarnished, while negative emotions such as anger, frustration, or even resentment are frequently disowned or turned inward in the form of harsh self-blame. This dynamic extends far beyond individual feelings. It shapes how the victim makes decisions and navigates relationships. The priorities and desires that guided everyday choices become subordinate to the manipulator's recurring needs. Even trivial events, from what groceries to buy or outings to accept, are reframed around the manipulator's comfort or approval. Decision-making becomes compromised, characterized not by autonomy but by avoidance of backlash, guilt, or sulking withdrawal. In this altered landscape, the victim suppresses self-expression to prevent emotional upheaval, convincing themselves that peace is best maintained not by honesty but compliance. Over time, this progresses to erosion of self-confidence. The ability to trust in one's own choices wanes, replaced by a near-compulsive need to seek reassurance from the very person orchestrating the manipulation. Relationships outside the controlling dynamic inevitably suffer as well. Compelled by the persistent demands of the manipulator, the victim begins to withdraw from friends and family who might challenge the situation or highlight the unhealthy patterns. This isolation increases susceptibility, as the manipulator responds with further demands cloaked as emergencies or special needs, each one acting as another notch in the tightening leash. The fear of appearing disloyal to the manipulator compounds the guilt, creating a greater reluctance to reach out or even accept outside support. Shrinking networks of social and familial support strand the victim further out on this emotional island, reducing opportunities for outside perspective and honest encouragement. Case studies are stark in their illustration of these facts. In one documented situation, a woman named Carol became enmeshed in a relationship where her partner's daily catastrophes crowded out not only her social life, but also her capacity for professional advancement. Each failed attempt at establishing boundaries was met by her partner's withdrawal, his pained silence weaponized as evidence of her alleged coldness. Psychological studies, such as those led by Dr. Lenore Walker on learned helplessness, show a clear pattern. When confronted with cycles of guilt, obligation, and intermittent approval or love, individuals become increasingly reluctant to assert even modest needs or expectations, fearing destabilization of the only relationship that seems to matter. People fall for these manipulations out of deep-seated instincts to help, to belong, to maintain peace, or simply to uphold an identity of being generous or reliable. Yet over time, these strengths are used as levers, warping self-image so that assertiveness feels like cruelty and withdrawal feels like betrayal. This is why knowledge is the most urgent shield. Understanding how emotional control is wielded can be the difference between perpetual exhaustion and genuine freedom. In the next part, we will dissect the hidden warning signs that most people never see, the clues buried in daily interactions that signal you are being pressured and what that pressure will inevitably cost. Manipulators refining their pressure tactics select their targets with deliberate precision, seeking out those whose innate empathy or history of accommodating others creates an opening for control. They are attuned to subtle cues, someone who volunteers first, who downplays their own needs, who is hesitant to impose or challenge authority. The ideal target is not necessarily weak, but internally conditioned to equate self-worth with being needed or accepted. Manipulators test their hypothesis with small, innocuous asks, observing whether discomfort arises with refusal or whether gratitude follows on compliance. Once the dynamic is confirmed, the intensity and frequency of demands escalate under the guise of shared history, emotional emergencies, or group loyalty. Those who shrink from conflict, or who value peace above their own priorities, soon find their reactions mapped and mirrored, making it easier for the manipulator to forecast when and how pressure will be most effective. Consider the situation of Victor, newly transferred to a small team and eager to make a positive impression. His team lead, Jordan, identified Victor as someone who would routinely pick up extra assignments without complaint. Jordan, skillful in deploying both encouragement and veiled guilt, made Victor his go-to for late nights or weekend cover, often referring to Victor as a lifesaver in group emails. Requests were routinely prefaced by lamenting how overburdened everyone felt, then pointed at Victor in a tone that made refusal unthinkable. Over a span of months, what began as sporadic help solidified. Victor would almost automatically rearrange his personal schedule to fulfill Jordan's newest need, sometimes before it was even communicated. Each time Victor contemplated pushing back, the anxiety he felt seemed disproportionate, yet his mind quickly conjured images of team disappointment or Jordan's characteristic coldness whenever Victor hesitated. This anticipation of negative response, paired with praise after every act of compliance, conditioned Victor to preemptively offer assistance, gradually emptying himself in the process. The insidious nature of such manipulation unfolds as psychological shifts. Early compliance is glazed in the satisfaction of being indispensable. There is pride in feeling chosen, useful, or central to the group. But as the relationship deepens, positive reinforcement transforms into anxious anticipation. Boundaries blur, personal needs dull under the demand to constantly deliver, and the mere idea of protest births pressure instead of resolve. The repeated experience of guilt and the desperate need to avoid someone else's disappointment detach the victim from their natural assessment of fairness or reciprocity. Over time, emotional compliance gives way to near-reflexive obedience, not because it is sustainable, but because the act of resistance now feels more hazardous than collapse. Research on interpersonal influence and organizational behavior has demonstrated this process repeatedly. Those with high agreeableness or deep motivation to avoid conflict are especially targeted within systems where teamwork or relationship harmony is overtly encouraged, yet structurally skewed for exploitation. Patterns in these settings recur with alarming consistency. The same language of loyalty, the gradual escalation of requests, the fusion of disproportionate gratitude and controlled displeasure. The target's sense of self narrows to the edges drawn by another's expectation, stifling assertion long before the loss becomes conscious. Understanding how pressure is identified, implemented, and rationalized is therefore the cornerstone of defense. To resist, one must see these patterns before repetition breeds resignation, and before temporary discomfort becomes a defining feature of existence. In the next part, we investigate exactly how cycles of pressure intensify, setting the stage for deeper entrapment, or, with awareness, for decisive and lasting liberation. Chapter 6. Thriving Beyond Their Grasp. In the quiet sanctuary of her apartment, Olivia scrolled through her messages, her thumb hovering over a notification from Paula, a friend she'd known for years. The conversation had started innocently enough. Paula seeking input on a job application, advice on resumes, and comfort on stressful days. Yet Olivia now sensed a pattern that had only recently become visible. Every interaction left her emotionally depleted, burdened by stories of crisis, requests for urgent help, and subtle suggestions that life without Olivia's support would unravel. Each attempt to withdraw or gently redirect the conversation toward her own aspirations met with Paula's disappointment or veiled comments about loyalty and abandonment. Olivia's achievements, her new promotion, her joyful plans for travel, were unfailingly diminished or eclipsed by Paula's dramas. When she finally mustered the courage to celebrate herself, her friend artfully reminded her, "Not everyone is so lucky," shifting the attention back with surgical precision. What Olivia failed to see until exhaustion forced clarity was how her ambitions and spirit had been methodically starved to feed the green vines of another's need. Paula's ultimate aim stretched far beyond simple companionship. She calibrated each interaction to maintain emotional dominance, enforcing a quiet compliance and ensuring Olivia's energy was spent soothing wounds not her own. These encounters weren't random cries for help, but calculated moves in a broader strategy, ensuring that Olivia stayed reliably within Paula's orbit, emotionally on call, and subtly discouraged from investing elsewhere. Even pauses in communication brought a fresh round of accusations or passive reminders, teaching Olivia that relaxation or distance would be punished by coldness or guilt. In this suffocating pattern, Paula had masked exploitation as friendship, starving Olivia's growth so completely that any nascent outburst of self-assertion now sparked panic and uncertainty. The insidious success of such manipulation is rooted as ever in its incrementalism. Neither Olivia nor those trapped in similar cycles recognize the magnitude of their entrapment until the color drains from life itself, until days pass without creative recharge and excitement dims beneath fatigue. Goals shrink, timetables are suspended, and self-doubt flourishes where confidence once stood. So thorough is the entanglement that Olivia began to apologize for having boundaries, measuring her worth by Paula's shifting barometer of approval or disappointment. Here, emotional freedom has been reduced to a sparrow's wingspan, clipped with every guilt trip cloaked in familiarity. What so many fail to recognize is not simply the fact of manipulation, but its cost: lost opportunities, diminished joy, and the quiet eradication of autonomy that marks the difference between mere survival and true thriving. This is the hidden calculus at the heart of manipulative relationships, the secret misdirection that keeps energy, affection, and ambition tethered to those who seldom return it in full. Not all prisons are built with locks and keys. Some are constructed in the language of friendship, the expectation of self-sacrifice, and the ceaseless trade of personal fulfillment for approval. Until the whole weight of this exchange becomes undeniable, those targeted remain trapped in expanding circles drawn ever tighter around their unrealized selves. To thrive beyond these grasping currents means first to name them for what they are, illuminating paths away from exhaustion and towards self-chosen growth. The aftermath of enduring cycles of manipulation is felt most profoundly on the emotional landscape, where feelings of vitality, optimism, and even self-respect are corroded by constant obligation and subtle disapproval. Individuals like Olivia find their internal compass slowly overridden by another's repeated doubts and redirected expectations. As manipulative demands tighten, satisfaction drawn from genuine accomplishments is steadily replaced by relief at simply keeping the peace or avoiding conflict. The joy of new experiences becomes tinged by anxiety. Will my happiness cause hurt or trigger passive rebuke? Day-to-day decision-making shifts in response to anticipated reactions, turning even minor choices into a labyrinth lined with guilt and self-censorship. In these moments, agency withers. The person trained to soothe another's world feels less and less capable of steering their own. This phenomenon extends through every relationship touched by the manipulator's influence. Friends and colleagues may notice the ever-present fatigue, the absence from activities once loved, or a growing reticence to celebrate personal achievements. Yet, when questioned, the individual caught in the cycle often grows defensive, rationalizing their sacrifices as loyalty or kindness. The emotional calculus becomes more complex. In prioritizing the manipulator's needs, the victim distances themselves from sources of genuine care, straining bonds that could offer perspective and support. Relationships, once balanced and reciprocal, grow brittle or vanish altogether, feeding a dangerous belief that all connection must be paid for with a steady tithe of one's energy and joy. Eroded self-esteem anchors this spiral. Real-life accounts consistently support this. In a documented case, Darnell, an aspiring entrepreneur, gradually let go of his business goals to stabilize an emotionally needy partner, Mona. Whenever he set aside time for work, Mona would allude to past betrayals or craft narratives of abandonment, until Darnell, racked by guilt, would drop everything to reassure or comfort her. With each cycle, Darnell doubted more of his decisions, eventually internalizing a belief that his ambition was inherently selfish. This surrender was not a consequence of weakness, but a sophisticated psychological conditioning expertly maintained through Mona's pattern of pain and reward. Once his self-image warped to fit the shape of her approval, the distance between his intentions and his actions grew so severe that only crisis could restore honest self-reflection. Research into relational manipulation underscores these dynamics. Notable studies led by Dr. Susan Forward and Dr. Sandy Hotchkiss highlight how emotional manipulation, especially in the guise of friendship or love, produces chronic self-doubt syndrome. Victims repeatedly suppress or revise their desires to avoid harm, responding to the manipulator's needs with the urgency typically reserved for personal danger. Over time, the line between true compassion and compulsive people-pleasing vanishes. The emotional pressure fosters learned helplessness, making resistance feel insurmountable, and training the victim to accept constriction as inevitable reality. These outcomes are built upon universally shared desires: to belong, to be appreciated, and not to cause suffering. Manipulators intuitively recognize and exploit these drives, framing every plea as a test of character, every withdrawal as a moral failing, and every latent resistance as selfish arrogance. Over time, the victim's vision contracts to the scope defined by the manipulator, narrowing possibility, quelling the impulse toward independent fulfillment. Recognizing how this manipulation erodes the fabric of self-worth and dims life's possibilities is vital not merely for recovery, but for transformation. As we move forward, the next part will expose the easily overlooked warning signs that signal entrapment, enabling a proactive shift from silent endurance to active, empowered resistance. Manipulators rarely approach their targets blindly. Instead, they are highly attuned to emotional patterns and relational dynamics, studying which individuals display the greatest readiness to give, the highest discomfort with confrontation, or the deepest longing for inclusion and affirmation. The manipulator seeks the friend who volunteers with a little too much enthusiasm, the family member prone to soften conflict with humor, or the coworker who fills in the silences to preserve harmony, even at personal cost. Often, the impetus for targeting comes from a brief test, a favor asked, a confidence shared, an invitation to solve a problem no one else wants. If their request is met with ready compliance, if guilt is easily evoked, or if an apology is given in response to even the most minor request, the manipulator notes this, internalizing the signs of a receptive target and recalibrating their approach accordingly. A case that demonstrates this process involves Lena, an energetic community leader who juggled commitments with impressive efficiency. During a fundraising campaign, her colleague Neil began to confide in her, first with modest stories of stress, and then gradually with urgent pleas for late-night planning or emotional support. Lena, who prided herself on being dependable, responded consistently, offering not only her time, but increasing personal investment to keep things on track. With each episode, Neil made his gratitude dependent on whether Lena prioritized his needs above her own family or leisure. Subtle punishments followed any attempt by Lena to suggest boundaries. He would withdraw emotionally, postpone responses, or hint that her value to the group was now in question. Eventually, Lena felt both unable to step back and ashamed to speak up. Despite her leadership position, she found herself justifying every sacrifice as part of the job, or an obligation specific to her character. The trap was set, and Neil, through trial and error, had discovered precisely how to extract what he wanted without explicit aggression. The psychological shifts during such manipulation are both incremental and insidious. Initially, the target's self-esteem receives reinforcement from being trusted or leaned upon. However, the internal narrative slowly warps. The pleasures of service transform into escalating anxiety as yes becomes the expected answer, and guilt shadows any private thought of refusal. Over time, this subtle coercion transforms perception. Boundaries seem unreasonable or selfish, and the notion of limiting one's helpfulness is confused with a lack of compassion or maturity. As Lena's story illustrates, the target may start modifying their plans preemptively, instinctively sidestepping opportunities or celebrations if there is any chance their benefactor will disapprove or claim need. The emotional labor increases, but the manipulator adjusts their story. "No one understands my stress like you do," they'll say, cementing the belief that refusal equates with betrayal. Numerous psychological studies affirm that the more frequently these cycles repeat, the greater the target's vulnerability becomes. Once the habits of suppression and self-sacrifice have settled, targets become easier to exploit, often yielding with less and less resistance, even as their well-being diminishes. This process is particularly lethal to self-sufficiency and resilience. Before long, the victim's identity is so bound to another's approval that reclaiming lost ground seems impossible. Recognizing these calculated, tailored tactics is crucial for cultivating inner defenses. Awareness enables a conscious recalibration in behavior, allowing new boundaries to emerge and thrive. With this critical self-knowledge, the manipulated individual is no longer a passive participant in their own exploitation, but begins to approach each interaction with discernment instead of reflexive surrender. As we move forward, we will examine how fully understanding and naming these cycles provides leverage for real change, addressing not only the escalation of control, but how lasting recovery and freedom become possible, even for those long ensnared. As you've now uncovered, the journey to set firm boundaries with manipulators demands awareness, courage, and true self-respect. This book has revealed the hidden tactics of control, spotting manipulation, breaking its grip, rebuilding boundaries, asserting your limits, and ultimately reclaiming your autonomy. Remember, thriving beyond the reach of manipulative influence is both your right and possibility. Thank you for investing your time and attention in strengthening yourself. If this content has empowered or resonated with you, we invite you to like, comment, and subscribe to Stealth Psychology for more insights and support